step into the grand corridors of Buckingham Palace, where a tiny newborn princess once lay cradled beneath lavish ceilings, unaware she would grow into one of the most compassionate royals of the Victorian era. This is the story of Princess Alice Maud Mary, the remarkable daughter of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, whose fierce empathy broke through the gilded protocols of her day. From tending wartime casualties to pioneering modern nursing reforms, Alice became the heart and soul of social progress in the 19th century. Witness how her independent spirit clashed with royal expectations, how her empathy fueled daring acts of public service, and how her steadfast love for her family shaped Europe's royal lineage. Join us on this journey through hidden palace chambers, hospital wards, and spirited family letters as we uncover the life of a princess who dared to blend regal duty with an unwavering commitment to humanity. On a breezy spring morning in 1843, within the ornate halls of Buckingham Palace, the newborn Princess Alice Maud Mary made her first soft cries, unaware of the weight of history surrounding her. She was the third child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, that brilliant royal couple whose images were already woven into the fabric of the nation's consciousness. Outside, the city of London buzzed with its usual frenetic pace, carts rattling on cobblestone streets, voices rising in the markets. But inside the palace walls, time momentarily seemed to stand still. Here was this tiny princess, cradle gently rocking, as the queen looked on with both regal composure and a maternal gaze that betrayed her deeper emotions. From the beginning, everyone around her sensed that Alice would be different, for her eyes seemed to sparkle with a blend of curiosity and empathy. In the silence of that grand palace room, no one could yet grasp how deeply she would touch so many lives across Europe in her short span of 35 years. Growing up with 8 siblings in the vast royal household might sound like a never-ending parade of privilege, lessons, and formalities, and to some extent it was. Yet for Alice, the bustle of court life was less about shining in official ceremonies and more about discovering the world in her own reflective way. Prince Albert, her father, an intelligent, forward-thinking man, recognized in his daughter an unusual spark. When she wasn't running through corridors with her siblings or quietly examining the palace gardens, Alice could be found immersed in books about science or literature, or listening intently as her tutors explained concepts of natural philosophy. Her mother, Queen Victoria, had a penchant for order and propriety, ensuring that each of her children followed a strict code of discipline. But there was tenderness in their household too, especially from Albert, whose progressive spirit left an indelible mark on Alice. The palace was an odd mosaic of warmth, rigid schedules, and an undercurrent of duty that never really left them alone. Early on, Alice showed an uncanny sense of compassion. She would linger when palace servants fell ill, asking after their health, or volunteer to help a younger sibling struggling with a lesson. Even in her earliest letters, penned in a careful, slanted hand, she displayed empathy well beyond her years. The staff would whisper amongst themselves that the young princess possessed a heart unusually attuned to the pain of others. This empathetic temperament was only strengthened when she practiced music or painting. Whether she was at the piano or gently brushing color onto a canvas, Alice seemed to be channeling a world of unspoken emotion. Her father encouraged all his children in creative pursuits, but with Alice, he also ventured deeper into scientific discussions, sharing his broad interests. Albert's fascination with social reform, education, and the power of science as a beacon for humanity became a bedrock in Alice's mind, forming a moral compass she would carry throughout her life. In the tapestry of the siblings, Alice gravitated most closely toward her elder sister, Victoria, though they were quite different in temperament. Victoria, the eldest, was expected to be the polished reflection of their mother, destined to play a significant public role. Alice, on the other hand, sometimes chafed against the constraints of royal protocols. There were whispers in court that she inherited Albert's independent streak more than any of the others, and Queen Victoria occasionally fretted about her unpredictable nature. Yet there was a deep love between mother and daughter, even if that love was sometimes masked by disagreements. Queen Victoria had her ideas of what her children should do and be, while Alice, from an early age, formed ideas of her own. When the two locked horns over small points of discipline or preference, Prince Albert would sometimes step in, gently mediating the two strong-willed women, hoping to preserve harmony in the royal nursery. Shortly before her 18th birthday, however, her world shifted in a manner that would shape her character forever. Prince Albert fell gravely ill toward the end of 1861, rumored to be typhoid fever. The entire palace was plunged into an atmosphere of dread. Medical science at the time had advanced in fits and starts, but it was still a precarious era when a fever could snatch away even the most robust souls. Many of Alice's siblings were kept at a distance, partly out of fear and partly out of the desire to shield them, but Alice insisted on staying with her father. She spent hours at his bedside, holding his hand, reading to him, tending to him in small practical ways that mirrored the nursing she had observed in her studies. Her mother was distraught, engulfed by grief and dread. In those final days before Albert's passing, Alice became the quiet pillar of the family, a steadfast presence who tried to maintain household routines and provide comfort in the swirl of heartbreak. When he finally passed away in December 1861, it was Alice who shut his eyes, tears running silently down her face. The loss carved a deep wound in her soul, but it also cemented her dedication to the cause of caregiving and reform that Albert had so passionately believed in. In the oppressive aftermath of Albert's death, the palace halls fell silent, cloaked in mourning. Queen Victoria retreated into a veil of sorrow. Each child felt the loss, but Alice took it with both heartbreak and a curious sort of resolution, as though she wanted to continue her father's mission in every facet of her life. This meant stepping into a role of emotional caretaker for her siblings, but especially for her mother, whose grief had overshadowed all else. It also meant that when her engagement to Prince Louis of Hesse and Rhine was announced in 1861, the family stood at the crossroads of solemn mourning and an impending wedding. Rarely had a royal engagement happened in such a somber context. Alice found herself in the delicate position of forging a new life while she and the Queen still wore black in memory of Albert. By the time her wedding day arrived in the summer of 1862, the ceremony was, by royal standards, surprisingly subdued. Instead of the customary fanfare, the event carried a heavy air of reflection and subdued respect for the recently departed prince. Yet there was something quietly hopeful in that ceremony as well. Perhaps it was a reflection of Alice's own spirit. She knew joy and sorrow could coexist. In her wedding attire, she stood at the threshold of a new chapter, aware that life would never again be the same. As she boarded the carriage that would lead her to Osborne House, where the ceremony was held, onlookers saw a bride with an earnest expression, no trace of frivolous excitement, only a calm acceptance of the future awaiting her. She was no longer just a daughter to the British monarch. She was about to become the wife of a German prince, destined for a world with far fewer resources, but with ample scope for her philanthropic passions. Darmstadt, the capital of the Grand Duchy of Hesse, was a world away from the grandeur of Buckingham Palace. When Alice arrived there, the grey buildings and more modest palace stood in stark contrast to the familiarity she had left behind. The local court was smaller, the protocol less grand, and financially, the region was nowhere near as prosperous as Britain. Yet, Alice discovered a new kind of freedom here, a chance to shape her own identity away from the relentless expectations of London. She settled into the simpler environment with a surprising grace. People of Darmstadt were initially curious about this English princess, but they soon found her approachable, caring, and genuinely interested in their well-being. Unlike some royals content to remain behind gilded walls, Alice ventured out into the narrow streets, visited local hospitals, took note of the poor conditions, and set about to make changes. Her husband, Prince Louis, affectionately known to many as Louis IV, once he eventually ascended, was supportive, if a bit more traditional in his approach. Though not as passionate about reform as Alice, he stood by her in her philanthropic endeavors, admiring her tenacity and willingness to get directly involved. Their marriage was grounded in mutual respect, though it was not known to be a grand love affair full of rapturous declarations. Their bond was built on the daily trust they placed in each other, the occasional letter that expressed warmth, and the shared sense of duty toward the people they served. He marveled at her ability to juggle the demands of a growing family and her earnest philanthropic pursuits. Over the coming years, Alice gave birth to 7 children: Victoria, Elizabeth, Irene, Ernest Louis, Friedrich, Alex, and Marie. Each new arrival was both a blessing and a challenge. Hesse was strapped financially, limiting the luxurious upbringing her children might have had in England. Although Queen Victoria occasionally provided financial assistance, these requests led to friction. The Queen sometimes lectured her daughter, expecting a more conservative approach to life, and questioning whether Alice's philanthropic goals were overshadowing the practicalities of running a ducal household. Alice, stubborn in her own gentle way, would respond politely but firmly, explaining how she believed she was fulfilling Prince Albert's vision of social responsibility. The tension with her mother lingered like a faint but persistent undertone in their correspondence, where words of affection were peppered with suggestions, criticisms, and pleas for better budget management. Despite these challenges, Alice pushed forward on her projects. Inspired by the nursing reforms of Florence Nightingale, whose work Alice had read about with admiration, she set out to improve medical care in Hesse. She organized the training of nurses, insisting on higher standards of hygiene and education. People whispered that she would sometimes be found in hospital wards, comforting the ill, helping roll bandages, or adjusting pillows for patients. This was considered extraordinary behavior for a princess of her time. Nurses, initially startled to see the Grand Duchess in their midst, found that her direct involvement wasn't a fleeting curiosity, but a genuine, sustained commitment. She helped form the Alice Frauenverein, Alice Women's Association, which offered structured training and advocated for better hospital conditions, improved ventilation, and the use of antiseptics. Still a relatively new concept in medical circles. It wasn't just healthcare. Alice advocated for educational improvements too, particularly for girls and underprivileged children. She believed that a well-rounded education, which went beyond simple literacy, could open doors of possibility, break cycles of poverty, and elevate a community. In many ways, she was at the forefront of a broader shift in 19th century Europe, where social reform was increasingly seen as a moral imperative. Although others might have talked loftily about progress, few royals rolled up their sleeves in the same way Alice did. She visited orphanages, sponsored scholarships, and encouraged modern teaching methods she had read about, once again echoing that forward-looking spirit of her beloved father. But history rarely stands still, and Europe was in the midst of tumultuous changes. In 1866, the Austro-Prussian War erupted, dragging the small Grand Duchy of Hesse into the conflict on the side of Austria. When Prussia emerged victorious, Hesse lost not only territory, but also whatever fragile financial stability it had. The immediate aftermath was a region in need of reconstruction and morale-boosting efforts. Alice, pregnant and managing a young family, didn't hesitate to help organize medical assistance for wounded soldiers. She set up makeshift hospitals in local halls, leaning on her experiences and her budding network of trained nurses. This was not a sanitized version of charity. It was gritty, exhausting, often heartbreaking work. Soldiers arrived with dire injuries, infection looming everywhere. Alice supervised basic triage, advocated for more disinfectants, and wrote detailed letters to procure supplies, all while dealing with her own sense of exhaustion. Her dedication took a toll on her health. Long hours in cramped hospital spaces, exposure to a range of illnesses, and the emotional weight of what she witnessed wore her down. Louis grew concerned, but Alice brushed aside his worries, saying that the men on those cots needed her more than she needed rest. Word spread throughout Hesse of her hands-on heroism, and gratitude swelled among the populace. This was no distant duchess living a fairy tale life. This was someone who, in her own refined yet determined way, tried to embody compassion in a world rife with suffering. It was a pivotal chapter in her life, one that elevated her standing in the public eye and perhaps deepened her resolve that the path she walked, torn between personal well-being and public service, was the right one. Time marched on, and eventually the gloom of war began to fade. Alice returned her focus to raising her growing children. She was a mother who insisted on personally imparting lessons about empathy, civic duty, and curiosity, instead of leaving it all to governesses. She taught them basic things like playing the piano or painting rudimentary watercolors, but more significantly, she taught them about the world's inequities, encouraging them to ask how they might help those less fortunate. Each child, especially little Alex, destined to become Empress of Russia, absorbed these lessons in different ways. Alice sometimes worried about how her daughters would navigate the tightrope of European politics and alliances, but she was steadfast in instilling the belief that they should never forget the humanity of those around them, whether they wore silks or rags. Even as these fulfilling domestic and philanthropic pursuits carried on, Alice maintained a steady correspondence with her mother. Queen Victoria's letters shifted between maternal pride and pointed critiques. She admired Alice's achievements, but worried incessantly about her daughter's health and the perceived excessive involvement in local politics. The Queen often believed that royalty should maintain a certain distance, a grandeur that commanded respect. Alice's more hands-on style struck her as a departure from tradition, but Alice, in her polite responses, would remind her mother of Prince Albert's teachings and the calling she felt so strongly. She found some comfort in knowing her sister Victoria understood the complex balancing act and supported her wholeheartedly. In quieter moments, Alice herself might have questioned if she was pushing too hard, but she felt powerless to ignore the needs she saw all around her. In 1877, a major event occurred that changed her standing in Hesse. Louis ascended to the position of Grand Duke, making Alice the Grand Duchess. One might assume that this title would come with increased resources and a more lavish lifestyle, but the region's financial struggles were persistent. The new responsibilities added to her sense of duty. Now, more than ever, the people looked to her for leadership, guidance, and the continuation of social improvements she had championed. Official ceremonies, diplomatic receptions, and obligations of rank increased. But rather than letting these formalities overshadow her philanthropic focus, she used her elevated status to push for more wide-reaching changes in healthcare and education. She leveraged her influence to foster alliances with other European reformers, wrote to potential donors, and expanded the reach of the Alice Frauenverein. Yet the royal family was not spared from personal tragedies. Illness seemed to lurk in the corners of the palace, a cold that turned severe, a childhood fever that refused to abate. Health crises were constant worries in an era when modern antibiotics didn't exist. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the final blow in 1878, when a wave of diphtheria descended upon the family's residence. One by one, several of Alice's children fell ill, their throats swelling and fevers raging. The atmosphere in the palace grew tense and grim. Doctors did what they could, but the disease spread with terrifying speed. Alice's heart clenched with fear. She tried to keep calm, drawing on her nursing experience, administering soothing treatments, and sending frantic messages to doctors near and far. Despite her tireless efforts, her youngest daughter, Marie, succumbed to the disease in November of that year. The child's death devastated Alice, but she refused to retreat in grief, not while the others were still sick and in need of her care. Those weeks were a fog of exhaustion and sorrow. Alice herself eventually contracted the same infection. Over the years, her tireless devotion to the sick and the needy had eroded her health, making her vulnerable. Yet no one around her imagined she might actually lose her life. She was, after all, that steadfast duchess who had weathered war, heartbreak, and countless hospital wards. But diphtheria showed no mercy. In December of 1878, on the anniversary of her father's death 17 years prior, Princess Alice breathed her last in Darmstadt's new palace. She was just 35 years old, leaving behind a family in shock and a region in mourning. Outside, the crisp winter air seemed eerily still, as if the entire city paused to absorb the gravity of the news. Flags lowered, church bells tolled, and in palace corridors, her children grieved a mother whose guiding light had shone brightly and suddenly gone out. News of her passing reached Queen Victoria like a harsh echo of Albert's death. The Queen, already scarred by years of mourning, found herself reliving the agony of losing Albert through the loss of the daughter who had been so like him in spirit. For weeks, it was said that Queen Victoria barely spoke, carrying a sorrow that words couldn't alleviate. Messages of condolence poured in from across Europe. Many who had never met Alice felt the sting of her loss, having been moved by stories of her dedication to the wounded and sick. In Hesse, crowds gathered outside the palace gates, lighting candles and whispering prayers of gratitude for the woman they'd come to see as their angel of mercy. For them, she was more than a grand duchess. She was proof that compassion could flourish in the highest of places. Alice's funeral was as solemn and dignified as one might expect, but there was a special poignancy beneath the ceremonial veneer. Nobles and commoners alike stood shoulder to shoulder to pay their respects. Her coffin, adorned with floral tributes from her children, left the palace in a quiet procession. As it passed by, people bowed their heads, tears streaming down faces that, for once, were united in grief regardless of class. Laid to rest at the church of St. Ludwig in Darmstadt, she was mourned not only as a princess and a duchess, but as a nurturing force that bridged social divides. A monument was erected in her memory, but the true memorial lay in the countless hospitals, schools, and charitable institutions that bore her influence. Through them, her spirit would live on,